Welcome to Pick Up and Deliver, the podcast where I pick up my audio recorder when I drop my kid off at school and deliver an episode to you while I walk home. I'm Brendan Riley. Well, good morning, listeners. I hope you're having a pleasant day. It is Tuesday, February 4th, February 5th. And I am enjoying a walk home in the brisk Chicago February. The weather has dropped to high 20s with the sky of a kind of slate gray one would expect for February. Got my hat and gloves on, and it's just going to get colder in the coming days. So back to normal February temperature. Thanks for joining me today. Before I forget, I wanted to mention, if you aren't a listener of the Forgot My Dice podcast, maybe give that a listen. Forgot My Dice is a podcast run by two fellas, Jonathan and Robert, and they talk about a variety of gaming-focused issues. They talk about pop culture some, they talk about games. One of the things I like about that podcast over many of the others I play is that Robert in particular is a pretty avid role-playing game player, as is Jonathan, but Robert is really the expert. And they spend a lot of time talking about different role-playing game systems that have come out and various role-playing topics. So that's not as big a part of my gaming podcast diet as other shows tend to be. I mean, I listen to the Secret Cabal's role-playing game podcasts some, but to be frank, I'll skip that sometimes as well. So it's nice. It's a good podcast. The most recent episode coming out actually today when I'm recording this, 2 days ago when you're hearing this, is an episode about zombies in games and films. And guess who is the special guest? That's right, me. So if you can't get enough listening to me for 20 minutes at a shot, I am a guest on the whole episode, so it's like 2 hours of craziness. So head over there, Forgot My Dice podcast, and take a listen. I will put a link in the show notes to this episode if you're looking for that. All right, enough of the promotional business for the day. On to our topic. So over in the Q&A forum, regular listener Chris posted a comment actually about a couple games that he played with me on a recent Tuesday, and that is his comment. I've made the mistake of not actually writing down the actual wording of his comment, but essentially what he said was, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about Wingspan and London and the relationship between the two, because I noticed some similarities when we played them. So I thought I would do just that. I'll start with London. London is a game by Martin Wallace that was released maybe 2010 or 2009, and then re-released in a second edition in 2018 from Osprey Games. It's a beautiful, tight second edition with really crisp design. Wallace also took the opportunity of the reprint to get rid of the board and replace it with these cards instead. So the area control element of London has been removed in favor of borough cards, where you develop the boroughs of the city. The premise is that you are prominent architects developing the city after the Great Fire of the 1600s, and your goal is to gain as much reputation as you can throughout the game. It's a card-based game, mostly. The other game I want to talk about is Wingspan. This is a new game from Stonemaier Games. I've mentioned it a couple times already. Designed by Elizabeth Hargrave. This is an engine-building game about collecting birds in your aviary. It's very pretty. It has nice egg components and a fun little dice tower and big chunky wooden dice. It's a really nice tactile experience, along with being a very good game. So I wanted to talk a little bit today about how these two games connect, how they overlap as play experiences, and where they diverge. So if you've been considering Wingspan or London as games you'd like to try, perhaps this will help you decide which one or both is right for you. Just as a reminder, both of these are in my 10 for 10s. London is locked in as part of my hardcore 10 for 10, and Wingspan is in as a is in my organic 10 for 10, and I've already got 6 plays of it this year because I'm doing the solo challenge over on Board Game Geek. So that will probably be the first game in my organic 10 for 10 that I complete. Pretty excited about that. So I thought I'd start with similarities because that's more fun. So I noticed 3 in Wingspan. So both games depend on you acquiring cards and adding those cards to your tableau. And then you can trigger those cards using different actions. So putting the card is one action, using the card is a separate action. In both games, as the game goes along, you increase in the power of that running action. In Wingspan, you get to do that more often because there are 4 basic actions that you can take in the game, and one of them is laying down a card. The other 3 are the other actions of the game, either collecting eggs, cards, or resources. But then in each of those rows, you trigger any cards that have powers on them when you do them. So if you play a bird card that triggers whenever you collect resources, and then your next turn you collect resources, you also then trigger that card that triggers when you collect resources. So one of the things I found very effective as a strategy is to try to fill one of those rows, particularly the resource row, with one card that draws cards, and one card that gets eggs, and one card that collects, and then you collect the resources when you do that row. And then you're actually refilling all of your resource banks every time you take the resource action. It's really an efficient way to do it. In London, you play cards down in stacks, and you can have as many stacks as you like, but each additional stack that you have generates more negative points for you at the end of the game. And so I really like having and a lot of the stacks, you run your engine once and then the cards will turn over and you can't use them again. And so there's really an interesting element of managing how many stacks you put out, and the more stacks you have, the harder it is to keep your negatives in control, but we'll get to that. But both games have this idea of building up as you go along. Your later engine actions, where you're running your engine, are stronger than the earlier ones. Both games also have a really interesting element where they're constantly making you choose which cards to get rid of. Wingspan leaps right off with a Terraforming Mars style card selection. You get 5 cards at the beginning. You keep some number of them, say 2 or 3 usually, and then you have to pay one of your 5 starting resources for each of the cards that you keep. So if you keep 3 cards at the beginning of the game, you have to pay 3 resources, which means you only have 2 left with which to play those cards. Contrary-wise, if you keep 2 cards at the beginning, then you have more resources, but then you're going to have to take a card draw action earlier. You might just keep 1, or you might keep 5. There's lots of different things you could do, but you have to choose to give out cards. And then throughout the game, there's a number of times where you'll draw 2 cards and discard 1, where you take an action and you get to put a card from your hand under another card, which will score you a point, but obviously you can't then play that card. So Wingspan constantly has you choosing which cards to play. On top of that, at the very most, you could play 15 cards in the game. And that would be an incredible focus. Like, really all you're doing is focusing on playing more cards and not at all just getting the cheapest cards you can or something. I don't even know. But so with just 15 cards possible to play, there's already a limit there. In London, the choices are even more difficult this way, the choosing, because every time you play a card, you have to discard another card of the same color. So if you're going to play a blue card, you have to discard a blue card also, which is really tough because all the cards are good. There are no cards that are bad. There's some that are okay. Well, that's not true. There are bad cards, but you can't discard those ones. They're gray, and so you can't discard a blue card. You can't play a blue card and discard a gray card because the gray ones are not blue. So there are times when you can discard the gray cards, but they aren't easy to manage. So you have both games present you with really tough choices of which cards you want to get rid of. And finally, I would say this is not a problem for me in the way the games work, but both games have pretty limited player interaction. In Wingspan, there's a little bit more. There's a few actions where you get to do something on someone else's turn, or where you get to make somebody take something, or offer to someone to take something, and sometimes that will screw them up. There is a limited card pool that you can pull from, so you might take the card that they wanted. But it's pretty limited in the way of many Euros. London is similar in that the card pool in the middle is a limiting factor. I mean, one of the things I like about London is that, remember I was saying there's difficult choices because you have to discard a card every time you play one. Well, even harder though is that you're discarding that card to the middle of the game board, and other people can take that card then instead of one off the deck. So there's a really interesting push-pull of not only am I giving this up, but I'm offering it to someone else as well. But ultimately, both games are tableau builders, and it's about how efficient can you be with your resource given the choices you have, and not really very much doing something to other players or depending on what they're doing, except in the case of a few of the results. Both games have scoring elements that depend on other players, but generally pretty limited player interaction. So those are the similar experiences, and I can see where you could play London and Wingspan both in the same night, as Chris and I did, and come away feeling like they were very similar. And I think that they both sort of trigger in similar ways. That said, there are some crucial differences that I think would help you figure out which game is right for you if you're considering buying or playing one of these games. The first is this engine thing I talked about before. I explained a little bit, but I think it's really crucial to understand. In Wingspan, running your engine is almost always good. So you're building an engine by playing cards to your board, and then anytime you take one of the three resource actions, eggs, cards, or food, you get to run the engine that's attached to that resource. So you get to do whatever that says, and that's almost always good. As far as I know, there aren't any cards that are bad. There are some that don't do anything. They do something when you play them, but not during the engine part. And there are some that only trigger occasionally, like there's one that lets you roll the dice that aren't in the feeder and try to get a thing. So that one's kind of luck dependent. But generally, it's good when you get to run your engine. London is an interesting thing because running your engine can sometimes be very bad. The way London works, you are laying these cards out on the tableau, and each turn you get to do one of like 4 things, one of which is run your engine. Well, if you run your engine, you can trigger any number of the cards that are in your tableau that you want. After you have done so, some of them flip over, so you won't be able to use them again. But then you count how many stacks you have in your tableau, including like stacks you didn't trigger. And then you count how many cards you have in your hand, and you take poverty cubes for the total number there, plus a cube for every loan you've taken. So it's really easy if you aren't paying attention to like run your engine, gain 10 gold, gain 10 pounds, get rid of 3 poverty cubes, and then gain 8 poverty cubes. That's not at all uncommon. And it can be really frustrating if you're not careful. So one of the big differences, Wingspan, you're always trying to run your engine. London, the focus has to be efficiency of your engine first. Running it regularly, but if you don't run it efficiently, it actually worsens your position rather than helping it. The second difference I saw is how tight the games are. Now, don't get me wrong, if you're playing Wingspan either without much luck or without much care, it can feel like a pretty tight game, because at the beginning of the game, when you take a whole turn to get like 1 grain, that feels like a kind of crummy turn. Toward the end of the game, though, if you've been careful about building your engine, then you're taking a turn, you're getting 3 resources and triggering like 3 cards in your resource row, some of which will get you more resources or cards. As Wingspan continues, it gets to the point where it's not tight anymore, where you're actually choosing among the limited actions you have rather than limited resources. And that's a lovely way for the game to proceed. By contrast, London is tight throughout. Because of this constant worry over how much poverty you are accumulating, you have to constantly be really focusing on maximizing your turns, getting to a turn where you only have like 1 card in hand or maybe 2 before you run your engine, which means playing more cards, which might mean not triggering them, or it's just, it's always tight. And that makes London really satisfying, but also a pretty difficult game, I think. And more punishing is the word I guess I would use for new players. So one of the big differences, London is really tight. And that leads actually to my third one, which is about motivating players. When we talk about in education, we talk about different kinds of motivation. When you hear people talking about game design, it's about incentivizing behavior. And there's 2 ways to incentivize behavior, right? Whether it's your child or your student or your employee or your player, you can incentivize behavior either by promoting behavior through rewards or punishing behavior through demerits. What are the opposite of rewards? Punishments. So I didn't want to say punishing with punishments. If you make a game that disincentivizes poor strategy, that is equally a motivation as a game that incentivizes good strategy. And I would say that's the big difference, is that Wingspan heavily incentivizes good strategy by focusing on building an interesting engine, by really paying attention to how your cards work. Wingspan rewards you by giving you a robust experience that's really positive. Even if you're not doing as well as the other players, you end up without as many points as them, you often get a really good score and you have a nice array of birds you've built in front of you. By contrast, because in London you're gaining this reputation, but your reputation is heavily damaged by the resources you've taken, or by the loans you've taken, and by the poverty you have at the end. London is all about demerits, about disincentivizing you. In particular, the end score that the first time I played this game it just destroyed me, was at the end of the game, everybody adds up how much poverty they have. And the person who has the least, that becomes the 0 bar. You set the curve there. So let's say one person has 15 poverty, everybody else has more than 15. First thing that everyone does, everyone discards 15 poverty. So the person who had the lowest poverty, their final score is this final score set. Then everybody else has to subtract a number of points based on how much poverty they have. And as long as you have, say, 5 poverty or less after that moment, you're probably okay, because you're just going to lose a couple points. But as soon as you get over 5 poverty, your points start dropping dramatically, to the point that I think it's 15, if you have 15 poverty or more, no, that's not right. There's a certain point at which you start losing 3 points for every poverty cube you have over a certain amount. So you could be way ahead in points and then drop 20, 30 points easy in that poverty thing if you haven't been paying attention to how much other people have. So obviously this is a big negative experience at the end of the game, and certainly applies to the long-standing rule that one of my friends at Toggle Gaming has, which is that Martin Wallace hates you. I think that fits really well and makes for a good button to the episode. So lots of different things to think about as you play Wingspan and London, and compare the two as engine building games you could enjoy. I would say for a close comparison, if you like Wingspan or you like the sound of that, you may also want to check out Gizmos, which is another game in my 10 for 10, but it's another game that's engine building where it's almost all rewards and very few negatives, as opposed to London, which is a pretty big mix of the two. What engine builders have you played? Which ones do you think fit or distinguish themselves from these comparisons I've made here? What effect does a board have on the engine building experience? Drop by Pick Up and Deliver Guild 3269 over on Board Game Geek and let me know what you think, or just let us know any other comments or thoughts you have about the show. Thanks for listening, and I hope that your next walk is as pleasant as mine was. Bye-bye.
Brought to you by Rattlebox Games.